Today's video is sponsored by myself and my webshop tsmc.shop. Please go check it out. The new website is now live and we're constantly adding new products to get you a better shopping experience and the best possible tools and materials for your hobby needs. Today's video has kindly been made possible by the kind folks over at nFOUW. They have sent me out their newest whale, the 16K, and this one is a really nice 3D printer capable of printing incredibly detailed parts and having some extraordinary features. Now I could go over all of those features, but the website itself is really good in explaining everything in full detail, and I'm simply not that knowledgeable. So if you want to know more about the printer, please check out nFOUW's website and everything you need to know will be there. They have also kindly supported this video by sending over some resin which will be used on this project. For this printer I will not really be doing a build video but more so a review video of a 3D printed file, and that file is from my friend Oliver over at Ollie Fizzle on Cults 3D. He designs many wheels, trans kits for model kits, and also now full kits, which I've built a couple of on the channel already, so do check those videos out if you're interested in those, and also be sure to check out his page for all of his awesome 3D files. The files that I will be printing are from an upcoming kit he has been designing, the Koeningsegg Gemera. Now these files will be available on his Cults 3D page in roughly a week, and if they're not up there a week after uploading this video, then do just slide into his DMs, bug him about it until he does upload them. Now the great thing of combining a printing video, review video, together is that I can print files of parts that I want to use on a build or even a full kit in this case, and also put a printer through its paces. There are tons of very intricate and detailed parts included in this file set or kit, so to speak, and that is ideal for putting a printer through its paces to see if it's capable of capturing all of the small details, all of the complicated parts, and if they can be printed, and also various different angles, etc., to see if a printer is actually capable of what we need it to do, and in this case that is print parts for our model cars, or even specifically to this video, a full model kit. Now like I've mentioned many times before, I'm not a 3D printing expert. I have tested and reviewed a ton of printers and I know a fair few things about them, but for the most specific details I do suggest you check out some other channels like the 3D Printing Nerd, Uncle Jesse, and there's tons more out there that know a lot more about these things than I do, so don't go to me for advice. I just show you what I can do with them, and that is the very basic stuff that I need to print model kits, and or even more specifically parts for the models that I build. I myself am not capable of designing anything whatsoever except for some blocks and sticks in very basic 3D software, so I fully rely on others to design 3D parts that I can then print. Now as far as software goes, you do need some software for these printers to work. Now there are multiple softwares out there, more specifically from nFOUW themselves, and that is the nFOUW Slicer, or you can also use Chitubox, but I prefer to use the nFOUW Slicer as the settings for the printer that are loaded in there for the standard version are a lot better than the ones that are loaded into Chitubox. Now there are some downsides to the nFOUW Slicer. Some of the support settings, etc., don't really work as well, so I'm using a combination of the two slicers. I add the supports in Chitubox, then export the files, and then load the fully supported file into the nFOUW Slicer, and then slice it in order for the file to prepare for the printer with some of the basic settings that are already in that slicer that just work a little bit better than the ones that are loaded into Chitubox. Now you can change pretty much all of the settings in both slicers, so if I figure out what is wrong with the one in Chitubox, I can simply adjust them to the ones that are in the nFOUW Slicer to work better, but for now I simply just prefer to export the final sliced file with the nFOUW Slicer, as that works a bit better with the printer, until I figure out why, of course, that is. Now the only things that I changed to these settings are the bottom exposure time, the exposure time for the regular layers, and also the layer height itself. As a standard setting it goes to 0.05, which I think is a bit too thick for the small pieces that I'm printing. I want them to be as fine as possible. for the layer lines to pretty much be invisible. Now I did try to print at 0.01, but for some reason the printer did not really like that, had a ton of parts fail, and at 0.02 the layer lines are twice as thick but still incredibly thin. The printer just printed it all really nicely and it came out fine. You just need a little bit more sanding, maybe some filler primer, and then those layers will disappear in the end too, without too much hassle. And when it comes to the bottom exposure time, that is the time it takes to cure the first couple of layers that stick to the build plate. That was set really high, and with the resin that I'm using, that was a bit too high. That made it pretty much impossible to get the prints off of the build plate. In some cases destroying the prints, and in other cases just making the entire process incredibly annoying and frustrating, and also very, very time consuming. Now if a print is stuck, you're probably using some tools that could be very sharp, very hard, and making it a bit dangerous as well. So do be careful with that, but I do think that nOUW needs to figure out some of these settings a bit more, update them in the slicer to get them working a lot better in order to get the prints off of the build plate. Now, in some cases, or in all cases, you don't want the print to fall off of the build plate, but in this case, having them permanently glued on is a bit too much, so that should be figured out a bit more. In other words, nOUW just needs to do a bit more work on the settings, fine-tune them a little bit, and update them in the slicer for the consumer to have a bit more fun during the removal of the prints, but that shouldn't be too hard for some of their engineers over there. And in my case, I'm kind of figuring it out, but I'm not fully there yet. So with the basics of the printer now done, we can move on to loading some files, slicing them, and starting the printing. So if you grab yourself a file, have it fully supported in either your preferred software or just using the software from nOUW 3D, then just export it to your settings. Mine specifically, again, have been shown in the earlier bit of this video. You export them onto a USB stick or connect the printer to Wi-Fi and then send them that way. In my case, I just prefer the USB stick. Plug that into the printer, upload the file to the printer, and press print. Once the printing has been completed, remove the build plate from the printer, clean up the parts, remove all of the supports, and then cure the parts in your preferred methods. Now, I do want to show some of the parts before they are fully cured and finalized, ready for you to build. These still have the supports on them. You can use a heat source. In my case, I like to use a hairdryer, but you can also use a heat gun or hot water, just soaking the parts in there. This makes them a little bit softer and helps the supports break off a little bit easier. Now the resin is really of a super high quality. It does stink a little bit when you pour it into the printer initially, but that should just fade away after a couple of days. But it's not a real pleasant smell, so that is something to keep in mind. Once you heat them up, these supports pretty much just snap off, fall off really easily. You don't have to do it with this resin. I have found that it's pretty forgiving and the supports come off really easy in most cases. So with the supports now removed, you can move them into your curing chamber, cure them for the preferred time. I chose to go for about 10 minutes and that fully cured them to my liking. And then let's have a look at the parts a bit closer up. So let's start off with the biggest one, and that is of course the body itself. Most of it, that is going body color, is printed in one piece. Then of course you have some added extras like vents and other things that we'll show you a bit later that go on top, but this one is a major piece. It was not printed really without any faults. Now since it is a bigger piece, it is key to figure out all of the supports, have the proper settings for your printer. In my case, I just used the standard settings, adjusted them a little bit to go for a thinner layer height to have a smoother detail, added the auto supports and pressed print. Now that does sometimes miss a couple of supports. In general, about 95% of the supports are in the correct place, but in some cases some are missing in pretty critical spots, leading to either some failures or just some deformation on specific areas that don't look great. Now this of course needs to be figured out a bit more, and that requires a bit more testing and a bit more time. And for this video to go out, I didn't really have all that much time extra to just go figure it out, but that should just smooth itself out in the future. Now in any case, with all of the misalignment and some misprints out of the way, I did want to test out the resin just a little bit to see how well it accepted the paint, how easy it is to sand and correct. Now there are some very faint layer lines and also just a couple of layer shifts on here that kind of pretty easily sand it out. I'm using some 400 grit sanding sponges from Tamiya, just going over it really quickly, taking about 4 to 5 minutes to just generally sand one half of the body, apply some primer, apply a color just to see how it looks, and then move on. I found the resin to sand really easily. With a 400 grit sanding sponge, it just removes scratches and or imperfections, even some of the layer lines, fairly easily without too much hassle and or pressure. And after a couple coats of primer, maybe even a second round of sanding and a bit more primer, you should be left with a really nice and smooth piece. Now, just to be very clear, the parts that I'm painting here are just some test pieces, not the final bits. I'm still figuring out the printer, as I've mentioned too many times already, and I'm still figuring out some of the files, the best orientation, the best supports, etc. So I'm not really too bothered about these parts specifically. I'm just glossing over it a little bit with some primer, with some sanding and a bit of color to see how easy it is to get these parts smooth and to get some sort of proper look at the quality of this printer. Now, even though the parts are not the best quality they can be due to some user error, I'm pretty impressed with the way that these parts are coming out. A bit of sanding, a bit of primer, and most of it is already nice and smooth. As you can see on the left side, there is a small imperfection, but with a bit of sanding that came out pretty easily, and on the right side with no sanding it is still pretty visible, and it's pretty much the same imperfection on both sides. One was easily removed and the other one still there because I didn't really do anything to it. But that does show you that minimal effort can get you a long way and just goes really well with these printers and also this resin specifically from nFOUW 3D. So with a bit of primer now applied to the body, not much more work done to it whatsoever, it was time to put on some color. Now I'm just going to paint a couple small pieces, not going to go overboard as I simply just want to give it a bit of color and go through it just a tiny bit, but don't overdo it. Now for this I will be using a new airbrush from Gallery. This is the Mobius SP. Now usually you have a cup on top, in this case you have a cup on the bottom. Now in my case this airbrush is ideal as I paint a ton of parts and also have a couple of standard colors that I use a lot of. So you can just order some extra bottles, fill them with the paints, pre-thin them, and just pop them in place and the airbrush is ready to go. You don't have to pour the paint in or take the paint out afterwards. It just requires a very, very minimal amount of cleanup and is really easy to switch between colors without too much effort. Now if you're interested in one of these airbrushes, I will be leaving a link below to the Gallery website. I highly recommend their premium series airbrush as they are of a super high quality and are really capable for us modelers at an affordable price point. So like I said, for my specific case I use a ton of black, a ton of primer. I can just fill a couple of these bottles with the black already pre-thinned and have a nice pot of black ready to go really easily on the button. Now if you'd like to use this airbrush for multiple colors, then I'm not really sure if this is the right one for you. You would need a ton of different bottles and a labeling system, etc. to keep it all nice and neatly organized. But if you use a ton of the same colors a lot, then this would be ideal as you have them all ready to go pretty much. You don't need any pipettes, you have very little cleanup, and it's just incredibly easy to use. Now if that's not the case, then I would suggest to have an airbrush with the cup on top to have it just gravity fed. That makes it a lot easier if you use a ton more colors. It requires a bit more cleanup, but you don't have to have as many bottles set aside with the different colors pre-mixed and ready to go. Now luckily Gallery has a really wide variety of those airbrushes as well, so do check out the links in the description down below to Gallery if you're interested in one of these, and feel free to check them out. Of course, I highly recommend their premium line. Now like I said, I'm not really going to be using the other airbrush for many different colors, just a couple of the base tones that I use a lot of. So for the body I decided to go with a nice bright yellow as it pops pretty well on screen and also just is a bit nicer than the standard black or gray for a thumbnail. So I'm just using one of my gravity-fed airbrushes, which I really like as well, to go over the body with a couple of light coats of yellow to get it nicely covered. It took about 3 or 4 full build plates, one for the body, one for the main chassis, and 1.5 for all of the other parts to completely print this entire kit. And that looks something like this. Now, even though not all of the parts came out absolutely perfectly, again down to me and still getting used to the printer and the settings, there are some fine gems in here which show you how incredibly capable this printer is. Now, these parts are printed at 0.02, so that is not 0.01 that I usually do, but they are still incredibly nicely detailed, smooth pieces, and have a ton of capability shown in them for what this printer is capable of as far as details, smoothness, and just the parts that it can churn out. So without repeating myself too much, or let me rephrase, so with repeating myself as much as possible, the files that I'm printing here were specifically so I can test the printer, put it through its paces, show as many different parts, small, big, detailed, or just general parts, and show you what this printer is capable of. Now, just looking at this brake disc, it has a ton of flat areas, but also an incredibly small amount of detailed areas, or incredibly detailed areas with small details, and they came out absolutely beautiful. All of the logos, all of the tiniest amounts of details are perfectly captured. The shape is really nice, the smoothness is great, and also the amount of detail is just insane. Another nice torture test is one of these mesh bits that has some very fine mesh in it, a lot of holes, and it just printed it out no problem whatsoever, didn't even skip a beat. Besides the incredibly small and highly detailed pieces, it also turned out some really nice and smooth bigger pieces. Now, this engine cover is a larger piece, still has some details in it, but it is also one that requires some smooth edges, areas, and flat surfaces, which came out incredible. Same for the center console. There were a couple of small problems on the TV screen for the back, but the top general area looks nice. It captured all of the details and logos really well, even though some of the bottom part failed a little bit. Now again, user error, not specifically down to the printer, but that should be figured out in the future. Now I can just of course keep going on and on and on about all of the small details that it has captured and how well it has done so, but you're probably getting a bit tired of that, so I'm just going to skip a bit and move on to the next bit. Now, even though I'm not going to be using the parts that you see right here, or I might use some of them, might not, I will probably just reprint all of them once I have the printer fully figured out and dialed in, and then do a full build. Now, my question to you, would you like to see a full build? Would you like to see some specific colors, or are you simply just not that interested in 3D printing models at all and would rather just see me build regular kits on the channel like I've done in the past? It is very important for me to know what you guys want to see. If you don't care about 3D printers, then maybe I should just stop with that entirely. The resin printers are a bit more interesting than the regular plastic printers, of course, but that is all up to your feedback and what you want to see. In case you got very excited about these printed pieces and do want to see a build of this specific kit, then I will be leaving a link down below to the scale model experiment. He has fully printed this kit, done a detailed video about it, and also has a full build on it as well, which will be available on his channel. Now, I will be putting some photos on screen, or I've already done that right here, to see how this turned out, and it is pretty simply amazing. So go check it out. His videos are incredible. James does a ton for the modeling community, has lots of fun videos, and shares an incredible amount of knowledge, so do check out his channel and give it a subscribe. Now, to summarize this entire experience with the printer, overall I'm pretty happy with it. The design of the printer is really nice and sleek. It has a pop-up cover, so you don't have to lift it off and put it somewhere. It just flips up and it's out of your way. Now, the downside is that it takes up a bit of space behind the printer too, so in my case my shelf is not deep enough, so I have to turn it 90 degrees so I have space for the cover to flip out of. Not a really big issue, but it is something to take into consideration, and in my case it is a bit of a problem, but I also need to figure out where to put my printers in the future. Now, if that's not a problem for you, then great, it is a really nice feature to have. The build plate itself comes off pretty easily and also pops on really easily, just one screw. The resin vat is also nice and big, holds a ton of resin, so if you just fill it up to the top, you don't really have to worry about running out anytime soon. Luckily, on the front, you can just plug in your USB. The on-off switch is also on the front, same with, of course, the touchscreen and interface. It works really easy, really nice and responsive touchscreen, no problems there whatsoever. And it also has a ton of features on the printer itself. Again, do check out the website from nova3D for a ton more detail on all of it about this printer, which they are a lot better at telling you than I am, so just go look there if you are interested. Now, of course, there are some downsides to the printer, and that is this is a pretty new printer and not all of it has been figured out perfectly yet. Now, this could be down to some of the layer height and settings that I myself prefer, but then again, the standard settings I feel are not really optimized yet. So there is still a bit of figuring out to do by the brand and the engineers, but most of these things can be figured out by an experienced 3D printer, of course, as well. If you are interested in the files, I will be leaving links to Oliver. If you're interested in the printer and or the resin, I will be leaving links to Nova3D as well. Thank you guys for watching. Do be sure to leave comments down below and give me as much feedback as you'd like. This really helps the channel improve. I know a couple of things that I'm doing wrong, but it would still be nice to hear what you guys think.